and recording has started right now. So please, just to let you guys know that the session is recorded. So thank you guys, and thank you for complying as well. I think we have lost the video of Mr. Lani. Can you hear us?
No, it's okay. I switched off.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. So very quickly, right, we all know that since the COVID-19 pandemic started, a number of businesses have struggled, right? We have seen it has not been a roller coaster for businesses, and it has greatly influenced a lot of African startups. For a lot of startups, it has been growth in terms of traffic and traction and sales. But for others, right, it has been a downward spiral. You would agree with me that a lot of businesses are struggling at the moment to keep their businesses afloat as a result of the lockdown, and business operations are stopped. There has been a lot of issues with businesses, it's not business as usual. You can agree with me that it's not business as usual as it used to be. So very quickly, right, we are going to have Mr. Lani Yusuf. A quick profile. I'm sure you guys already know Mr. Lani, right? Mr. Lani Yusuf is the managing partner at Verraki Partners, and he leads their social sector practice. And he has previously served as the country managing director of Accenture, and was responsible for all aspects of firm strategy, team, and operations. Prior to joining Verraki, Mr. Lani Yusuf has played a critical role at JKK, while also working at Arthur Andersen before becoming Accenture. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Lani Yusuf to the conversation. I'm not sure you can hear us.
You probably can. Thank you very much for accepting our invite. And I guess
I can.
At this
point, I can hear you.
We'll jump right into the webinar by taking some of the questions we've been able to curate over the past since we began the preparatory exercises for this webinar. So, Samad, please let's dive right into it.
Okay. I think it's taking a few minutes. Okay, so Mr. Lani Yusuf, if you can hear me clearly. So our first question, we wanted to ask, looking at how a lot of businesses have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. What would you say has been the net effect of the pandemic on African startup or the African startup community generally?
Thank you, Abdul Samad and Haneef for the invitation. Right. So I think in looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the Nigerian startup, we need to look at it, in my view, across sectors. Right. So some sectors have benefited, while some sectors are struggling. But like Jack Ma said, perhaps the most important objective for any business in 2020 is to stay safe, is for the people to be safe and healthy. And it's less about the business, but more about the health and well-being of its talents, of its people. Right. And so I will argue that if we take that perspective, then perhaps a number of startups are successful. In terms of managing talent, I think startups are more agile, and so they were able to easily pivot to working from home. In fact, most startups were working from home ordinarily anyway. Either they work from home, they work from a hub, or they work from inside a car, right? So for startups, in terms of facilities, it really wasn't a major change. It was just an opportunity to do more of what we were doing before. In terms of funding, finance, I think for those who have reserves, they'll be lucky. For those who don't have reserves, it will have been a challenging last three months. Because if you don't have the capital, then how do you pay salaries? How do you pay your rent? Most landlords will still ask you to pay rent. So the number of startups have slashed salaries. They've reduced wages. A number of startups have reduced headcount so that they can manage their costs during this period when revenue may not be coming in as much. For startups who are doing digital products being products or services that you can sell anywhere on the online, I think they have been a very good. It's been an opportunity for them. But for startups that are into physical goods, so either you are a go-karter, you are a bike hailing, or you are a Uber, you are Uber-like and you're doing taxi hailing. I mean, so when government says no movement, then that means no market. That means no revenue for you. But if you are like Life Bank and you are in the health sector and you are providing oxygen for isolation centers, then you're in a very good spot. If you're in agri tech, and most of your consumers or most of your farms are in Ogun State and you are in Lagos State and there's no interstate movement, that is a major hindrance. So summary, the restrictions have affected different sectors and different startups based on the industry they belong to, based on how strong they were before the crisis started, and also based on how quickly they were able to respond in the first few weeks of the crisis, right? And some have benefited, some have seized the opportunities, while some have been in a challenging situation in the last few months.
Thank you very much. Of course, I totally agree with you on that. And that is what is even going to drive the conversation to our next question here, which is we understand that COVID-19 is a really defining event for a lot of businesses, right? We have seen a decline in some traditional industries like we used to know, and then we have seen the emergence of some new industries, some new startups, some new technologies, of course. But then what are some of the trends that you think that we should expect to see going forward?
So I mean, I will raise up my hands and plead that I'm not a soothsayer, I'm not a pastor and a man. So whatever I say is not a recommendation, it's just my own thinking, right? Um, but I think if we look at the consumption pattern in Nigeria, most of us we spend a lot on food. I mean, about 50% of our spending is on food. Then after food, you have education, you have health, you have transportation, you have accommodation, shelter, then you have a bit of clothing, right? Um, and so if you look at that spending pattern, then you can begin to say, okay, so how would COVID-19 or this experience impact the spending pattern? I think we'll still continue to eat, so the food sector will continue to thrive, and especially those who can be in the delivery mode. So I don't have to go to a restaurant, and 40 of us don't have to be in the restaurant to eat. So I can place my order online. The order can be delivered for me. So that would be a good area. So investment in agriculture, in agri-tech, will still be a good opportunity, especially if it's done the value chain. Online entertainment will be an incredible opportunity. I mean, So whether it's Teams or it's Zoom or it's Google, whatever, what can we do online? Now we have more than enough time. Nigeria has 200 million people. Of that 200 million, less than 100 million about 44% of those are below the age of 24. So we have about 100 million people who are senior enough, and we have over 154 million phone subscribers. So you could argue that all Nigerian adults have a cell phone, whether the cell phone is smart or is not smart. They all have a cell phone, and so that is a market for a lot of online entertainment, mobile entertainment, and I think that will continue to grow. And we've seen the huge growth in online betting. Betting is growing dramatically, and so online entertainment, online that will grow. I think we'll begin to see more investment and capabilities in online health. Before COVID, you and I will have to go to a clinic to be to meet the doctors and to get consultation. But during COVID, because people were fearful of not going to hospital and then they get infected, so we started a lot of people now doing online consultation. Even Lagos State now has the Eco Telemed. And I expect more of that will happen going forward, where more of healthcare delivery will now be done online. Pre-COVID, we were focusing on electronic medical records, which is the back office. But I think post-COVID, there will be more focus on the front office, so that you don't have to go to a clinic. You don't have to physically go until you really do need to. So your basic consultations, all of that can be done online. Same thing for education. Education now increasingly will be online, and that in itself is a potential cause of concern for me and for a number of other people. We have huge poverty gap. The few 1 or 2%, and the many at the bottom of the pyramid. We have about 36 million of us who are financially excluded. Financial exclusion is high. Now I think we are going to get a lot of digital exclusion, right? Because the rich and the kids in private school are all doing online learning as we speak. Some states are doing TV and radio learning 1 or 2 hours a day, but some private schools are doing 4 or 5 hours of serious online learning. Why a lot of private schools at the bottom of the pyramid, the low private schools and the public schools are not doing anything. And I'm not talking Lagos now, I'm talking nationwide, right? So the private school in my village is not doing anything. The private school in a village in the north is not doing anything. And if we don't take deliberate steps to make sure that digital capabilities are generally available in the country, we'll begin to create different classes of people. You begin to create young ones who are digital savvy, and you create some young ones who are digitally unexposed. And I think COVID-19 can accelerate that gap because today there is no third term in terms of education in Nigeria, but some schools and some students are learning. I'm on the board of Fountain University. That's the University of NASFAT. Fountain University students are undergoing online studies. In fact, the school has given all of them free data to do their online studies. I graduated from IFE. I'm not aware IFE is offering online studies. I'm not aware of the federal government or state universities are offering online studies as we speak. And our talents are competing in a globally competitive world. So the talents that you groom in Oshogbo or in Shaki are competing with talents from Beijing or talents from Sao Paulo or talent from New York City. And so we will make ourselves less competitive if we don't do a lot of online learning. So online learning, I expect will accelerate more in the future. So that's food, entertainment, agriculture, education, health. Communication will continue to be digital, and I expect that will accelerate. Areas where we'll have challenges will remain hospitality, will remain transportation, will remain physical entertainment. I'm not sure many of us will go into a cinema house today, to enjoy the comfort of and the experience of being in a cinema house. Rather, we'll be doing Netflix or the live streaming online. Okay.
Very interesting thoughts. Like even in recent time, right? I've been meaning to go to cinema just to say that, but then I can't go to cinema any longer because of COVID. But that's the new normal that we all have to adjust to, I guess. So from what you've said, for all these industries, for all these sectors, the entertainment, for e-learning, for transportation, and others, what do you consider the contributing success factors for all of these businesses, that will be thriving moving forward? What do you consider the contributing success factors for all of these businesses?
So I think for those businesses to thrive, a few things they need to focus on. The first is really around customer experience, right? Because ultimately, like you say, customer is king. Even though we all say it as a cliche, but customer experience is important. And there's this poster flying around the internet that it is customer. The difference between Amazon and the retail, the brick and mortar bookshop, it's about customer experience. The difference between Uber and your yellow taxis in Nigeria, it's about the customer experience, the customer convenience. So people still want to move from one location to the other. People still want to buy a book, but just that they don't want to go to a bookshop, and they also probably don't want to buy a physical book. Now they want to do an e-book, and they want to do it from their phone, from their houses, anywhere. Airbnb is about hospitality, so maybe I want to rent a room, but I may not want to necessarily rent a big hotel, 3-star or 4-star. I just want somewhere comfy where I can hide my head. And so customer experience is important. It's the customer experience that will allow customer engagement, that will lead to customer loyalty. And when customers are loyal to you, then they will spend more on your brand, they will spend more with you. So that is really the first success factor. The second one will be around people, your talent. You need to have, as a company, a pool of people who have good talents. And I would say a diverse pool of people, young, old, experience, black, white, female, male, etc. So you need to have that diverse group of people who will have talents, and you then need to manage them and be engaged with them well, so that you can bring out the best in your people. And when you bring out the best in your people, they will help you to deliver on your promise to the customer. So customer is the first side of the tripod. Second one is the people. And then the third, I would say, it's your own operations. How do you organize yourself? In today's time, we want to have a resilient and a diverse supply chain. So you don't want all your supplies to come from one customer or to come from one location, right? Imagine if you are based in Lagos and all your supplies come from Niyi Yusuf, who is in Ondo town, and government has said no movement, no interstate movement. So you want to have an operations that is resilient, that is diverse, and your operations will be from a supply chain point of view, will also be from a financial point of view, you want to have reserves, the financial capacity such that, you know, this thing can be 1 month, it can last 1 year. And there's no company that will survive on zero revenue. No company will survive on zero revenue. And you can easily be in a zero revenue state. And we've seen a number of companies who are in zero revenue during this period. And so the importance of a cash reserve or financial reserve or a cash buffer cannot be underestimated. And the other thing in terms of your success factors will be just the board, your governance. You know, corporate governance is important. And so you need to have a proper governance structure. And I'm not talking about your statutory board. Sometimes it's also just about your advisory board. Who are these players in the industry that can stand as a board of advisors that can give me tips and ideas, which can be different from your statutory board. But it's important to have that sense of that proper governance structure. Is that governance that will ensure that the money that is meant for the business, you don't use it to do parties, or you don't do the wrong thing. And lastly, the fifth thing I would say is being part of an ecosystem. An ecosystem where, you know, you are not the only one in this industry, and you have other parties, other bits of the block that are supporting you to ensure that you then have an industry that can scale, an industry that can withstand pressure. And for you as a company, your own challenge will be, how can I co-create? How can I work with my partners, my staff, my suppliers to co-create solutions that can excite our customers, that can lead to a positive customer experience? So I would say those are the 5 things to worry about: your customer experience, your engagement with your people, having the right governance structure, your operations that is resilient, and lastly, it's around being part of an ecosystem where you're able to co-create with others to provide solutions. Okay.
Thank you very much for that. And just to hammer, we saw something going on social media very recently about a refinery that recorded that recorded zilch in revenue. It was very surprising. We saw that going on social media very recently, and then a number of people couldn't fathom why, that business was still running. A lot of people were even criticizing as to why they wanted to shut down. It was a very important decision for the people that were running. So thank you very much. I totally agree on the cash buffer, and that's very imperative. But talking about operations now, you understand that for a number of startups at this period and businesses, either small or large, you would see them trying to pivot or strategize or imagine their business models. They are trying to target a different market. They are trying to see a different distribution channel to ensure that they are creating businesses that are profitable during this time and even afterwards, right? That people are trying to create resilient businesses, like you already mentioned, in this period and afterwards. What tips do you have for these small businesses, right? In terms of structure now, in terms of operations, in terms of strategy and trying to pivot. What are your thoughts on this?
All right. So I think the first thing is, a small business is different from a big business. A small business can be more agile than a big business, but a small business is also more fragile. It's more fragile than a big business. And so it's important to understand both, agility and fragility. And because a small business is fragile, um, there are certain risks that a small business should not expose itself to. And I think part of it is trying to be everything to everyone, trying to be in every market and trying to test all products and trying to do 1001 things, even though you only have 5 fingers. I mean, what a what a what a big company can do, a small company cannot, because they don't have the people, they don't have the talent, they don't have the asset, they don't have the resources, they don't have the financial capacity. And so I think the first thing is know yourself and know your limits and know what you are good at. Your typical SWOT. Do your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threat. And if all you have, for instance, if all you have is 10 million naira in your bank account, not the money that someone says they will give you tomorrow, or not the money that a distributor says they will pay in tomorrow. I'm talking about what you have in your bank account, because what you have in your bank account is the only thing you can plan on. The rest is wish list. I may promise you that I'll give you 1 million tomorrow, and I may change my mind tomorrow morning. You really can't take me to court. And even if you take me to court, the case will be in court for another few months. So plan based on what you have in your bank account. And if what you have is just 10 million naira, then that limits Thank you. Right. So if what you have is 10 million naira, for instance, as a small business, then that limits your flexibility. So that limits how much pivot you can do. Because you first need to ask yourself, what are my monthly running expenses? What are the things I must spend money on every month? And this 10 million, how much runway will it give me? Will this 10 million allow me to, assuming there is no other income coming in, for instance, this 10 million, can I spend it in 1 year or in 1 month? If the 10 million can be spent in only 2 months, then that means you have 2 months of existence left, because that's the amount of cash that you have. Now that limits the amount of pivoting and amount of experiments that you can do. But a big organization will have reserves, will have assets that they can use to pivot. So the point I'm trying to make is your strategy and the opportunities available to you will be detected by the nature of your company and the assets that you have. And if you barely have any reserves and whatever, then there is only so much of pivoting you can do. Because pivoting itself is a risk. You're going into new territory, which means you need to learn new things, build new customers. And so your revenue streams from pivoting may not happen immediately, may take a few weeks or months for that to happen. So you need to plan for that investment. I'm going to invest for 4, 5, 6 weeks before I get the revenue. I also need to plan for failures. It's not your first attempt at pivoting that will be successful. If it does, you are a superstar. For most organizations, you try 1 or 2 attempts before you become successful. Okay.
Interesting. And I really took on the point on agility and fragility and the relativity between both. It is very important in this climb, and I find that very valuable. I'm sure that every other person will also have learned something from that point that you have shared on pivoting and strategizing in this climb. I just wanted to take the opinion of Yinka quickly on, you said something about financing, so I wanted to take Yinka's opinion as a financial advisor as well in this space. So very quickly, Yinka, what do you think in terms of the financial decisions that would affect business sustainability in this new normal?
Thank you, Absamad. Thank you very much, Mr. Yusuf, for your time and the insights you have provided us so far. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, can hear you.
Yeah, I think, financing would be divided into two broad parts. So we will talk about strategic financing, which would be things around capital raising, funding, and whatnot from a strategic perspective. And then there will be operational financing, which is what Mr. Yusuf has spent the last few minutes providing insight on. From an operational financing perspective, it is clear that everybody, individual and business alike, needs to do away with everything that is non-essential at this point. And non-essential can mean different things to different businesses. But I guess what you need to look at is, what's my business model today? What are the things I need to do to remain profitable and scalable today? And what are the costs I need to continue to incur to ensure long-term sustainability? I think if you can answer those three questions, you have a clear sense of what your P&L should look like. And from a strategic financing point of view, I think maybe my advice for startup founders and management teams that are trying to sort of raise some money would be to tread cautiously at these times. Investors are wary of the economic impact of the pandemic, and by extension, we would expect that in the next 3 to 6 months, valuations will be depressed. So if you're trying to raise money and you're trying to go in at a certain valuation, then now may not be the best time. I think what businesses should be focusing on is how to sort of reassess demand. So demand has weakened through COVID, of course. Disposable income for many people have reduced. So what are the things that need to come back up to speed for you to be able to get sustainable levels of demand to sort of justify the valuation that you seek to put forward to investors? If you're worried, if you need capital at all costs, yields are also low. So if you want to consider a hybrid, so instead of raising equity, you want to consider things around convertible debt, just to be able to ride on the current decline in yields in the current economic terrain that we're in. That's also something that I would encourage founders to think about. But clearly, I know there's a lot of uncertainty and sort of risk or fear on the part of founders, but as long as your business model remains profitable, sustainable, and scalable, investors will still take a bet on you. However, I think in terms of delaying your capital raise or your fundraise for a few more months to be able to onboard those investors at better terms might be, in my opinion, is what I think would be a pragmatic approach to funding and financing at this time. Thank you so much.
Interesting, very interesting thoughts. Thank you so much, Yinka. Mr. Olani, I'll come back to you. And the question is, in terms of technological solutions, we have seen a lot of use cases of, solutions that are now emerging in the current time, like in telemedicine. We have seen a higher adoption rate of even technology solutions like, we used to know Zoom, right? But then Zoom stock just went all the way up there as a result of the pandemic. Let me not say as a result of the pandemic, but then as a result of the pandemic, right? And then we have seen even more innovative solutions sprout as a result of this pandemic. So what are some of the innovative solutions that we expect to see, right? We expect to see from the African startup community moving forward, right? What are the innovative solutions?
All right, so from the African startup, I think the thing is our own solutions must address our own peculiar challenges, right? And we have serious challenges in terms of human development, so which is around health, which is around education. We have significant challenges in terms of food security. We import most of the things that we eat. We are not able to preserve our food, so they are cheap when they're in season, and they become expensive when it's off season. We don't have enough processing capabilities. We don't have the machineries to do automated agriculture. So I'll be happy to see innovation in agriculture. Innovation, whether you call it GMO, that can increase the yield, or innovation in terms of the tools that we use, how we can use technology, how you can use a drone to plant, how you can use a drone to spray fertilizer and spray weeding, etc. So that's around food. Um, the communities that we live in, it's also an potential area for innovation, in terms of our community spaces, in terms of accommodation and the roof over our head. I hope to see some innovation coming out of that area. Transportation, it's also a potential area. Transportation, whether in urban or in rural areas. In the rural areas, what do we use? Bicycles or Okadas, because the roads are bad, etc. So could there be some transport mechanism for people and for goods? I hope there will be something. And if you look at then the underlining, the foundation, which for the most part now is financial services, which is payment. The exchange of value, that's payment. Or even in insurance. Insurance can be a risk management. So insure tech can be a risk management area. We need innovation around payments. Could be something as simple as one of the ventures that we support in Verraki, which is a cashback that allows you to exchange cash with anybody within a 5 minutes walk radius. I expect more of that will happen, so that instead of people having to walk 10 kilometers to an ATM or take a ride to an ATM, you could just do a cash exchange with someone within a 5 meter radius. So things that will ease the convenience of exchange of value between two parties. I expect to see a number of innovation in that space. I also expect to see innovation around entertainment. 154 million phone subscribers. Each of the phones could be a means of entertainment. I mean, beyond playing, we play the games on the phone. That screen in itself could be a cinema. So you got 154 mobile cinemas. So how can we turn all our cell phones into mobile cinemas? How can we turn them into what's it called? Payment, games console. Whether we're talking smartphone or not smartphone, each one has a screen. How can that screen become a game console? How can that screen become a cinema for video? How can that screen become a medical device to test your blood pressure, to test your breathing ability? How can that screen become a blackboard for teaching? Adam, for me, those are kind of innovation I hope to see, so that we can turn our natural advantage. Because our natural advantage today is that we have 154 million cell phones. That is more than 10 West African, that's more than 15 West African countries combined, right? How can we turn that into a market opportunity? Thanks.
Exactly. How do we leverage on seemingly peculiar or familiar solutions? How do we leverage it to create something like an innovation, something that's very innovative as a product and that can solve problems, right? Like I get you correctly.
Yeah, it's really just leverage what we have. So we have a comparative advantage compared to other countries. today we have 154 million cell phones. There is no other country in Africa, I think, that has 154 million cell phones. I don't think there's any. So, and if you have 154 million cell phones, so we should be asking ourselves, what can we do with those? How can we turn that into a bank or into an ATM? How can we turn that into a teaching device, into a medical device, into a payment device, into an entertainment device, as opposed to creating something new? I think that for me is the challenge I'd like to throw, and I hope to see a number of innovation in that, making use of the 154 million existing phones that we have.
Exactly. So, you have said a lot about strategy. You have said quite a number of things about pivoting. You have talked about the winners and some of the businesses that are not as that are not thriving as much as they used to. So, what do you think are the lessons that we can pick from this COVID-19 pandemic as far as the business goes? I know that there are a lot of lessons that we can take from it, but then I understand that your experience will help us narrow down lessons that are more business centric. So share with us, sir.
No, sorry, I didn't get the lesson. What I didn't get the question. Lessons from COVID-19 as far as what?
Okay, so I said that lessons that startup founders,
Okay,
business
for
executives,
startups.
yes, for business founders that they can learn from this COVID-19 pandemic
Okay,
as far as
so
business strategy and positioning is
yeah,
concerned.
so I think the first thing is really around capital. And like Yinka said, so whether it's operational capital or is your strategic capital, right? Have enough capital. Um, if you had wanted to do capital raising in March or in April, you couldn't have done it because everybody was locked down. And if your business really needed that capital to be able to do its research or do its operations, then boom, you are done. So I think the importance of capital, I mean, this lockdown or this pandemic has shown it, having enough capital. And capital is not necessarily profit, it's just having decent cash flow. I think the second thing is a product that is digital. I mean, when the GSM companies came into Nigeria in 20, whenever, like 15 or so years ago, they started with scratch card, right? So if you wanted to buy data, you wanted to top up your phone credit, you need to go and you need to walk down the road and then buy a scratch card, and then you scratch the card and you enter the pin. Now, assuming that was what happened, assuming we're still using scratch card and then we had a lockdown, assuming the banks didn't have online payments, you didn't have USSD, you didn't have internet banking, and we were in the Nigeria of 1990, which means you need to go to a branch and queue for teller. So you get your, what do they call it now? You queue up. Imagine how that could have happened or what that experience would have been like in a lockdown. So the importance of digital products and digital services, and for me, that's a huge lesson coming out of this COVID-19. The third lesson is around diversity. Diversity in terms of your products. So you have multiple products, and those products to be addressing multiple customer segments and to be addressing multiple markets. So assuming that, if you look at most schools today in Nigeria, if your entire business is the business of running a school, And essentially now we don't have a third term. So parents are not going to pay for a third term that doesn't exist. So you'll be hard pressed as an entrepreneur, as a business person, whose only source of income is classroom-based educational services. But if your education service that you provide is classroom-based, it's online-based, if it's for the young ones and it's also for the adults. So even if the young ones cannot come into classrooms, the adults can do online training, right? So diversity in terms of the products that you offer, the customer segments that you offer it to, and also probably the location, right? So if you are, so jokingly now, if you are a pastor or an imam, Lagos State has said they don't know when they will open churches or mosques. You are in bad shape. But if you have a church or a mosque in Kano that has opened, or in other places where they've opened, at least income will come from that area until when Lagos decides to open up. So geographical diversity is equally important. So I would say that not being concentrated in terms of customer, say, industry sector, geography, and the same thing also for people, right? You don't want to have a key man risk that you have only just one IT officer. So if the IT officer falls sick or decides to stop work, then you are unable to provide service. So just having that diversity in terms of your operation, in terms of customer, in terms of your market, adding for me is also the third lesson. So I would say those are my top three lessons for any business, either small or big, during this that I've learned from this COVID situation.
Very invaluable, sir. Like very, very invaluable. And that leads credence to the next question, which is more like a question for a lot of people that are interested in money and finance, right? So the question is more about the impact based on you understand that the COVID-19 has had like a tremendous impact on valuations, for example, of some startups. For some startups, there were even times that we saw that people started anticipating that we were going to have EBITDA. So we see behind it being after COVID-19, right? So how will predictions of a global recession that we have seen that the IMF also predicted that there's going to be a global recession very soon. So how do we expect that global recession to affect valuations and capital flows of startups and businesses in the current climate?
Is that for me or for Yinka?
It's for you, sir.
Okay. All right. So I think clearly there will be a recession. I mean, I don't think that's in doubt. I think what we are not sure of is how long, whether it's going to be 3 months or 3 years or 6 months or 12 months. But UK economy grew, by less than 24, sorry, negative 24% in the last quarter. The World Bank now predicts that the global economy will shrink by about 5% this year. I expect that Q2 Nigeria will have a negative GDP growth, because if people have been on lockdown mode, you've not been spending, GDP is a mix of consumption, investment, government expenditure, right? And if all those are not happening rapidly, then sure. So I expect a recession. What does that mean for company valuation? I think for most companies that target institutional investors are likely to get funding if they have good products. because the institutional investors already have the capital and they are looking for ways to deploy the capital. And so companies that target institutional investors will still get funding. Now, valuation will be challenged because there is no easy funding again. So there'll be more scrutiny around the numbers and valuations. But companies that are targeting individual investors, HNI investors, retail investors, I think are likely to struggle some more because retail investors may not have the kind of financial capacity to be able to support. I mean, if Nigerian banks begin to sack people, a lot of people will not have the cash to deploy, because an investment in a startup is a risky venture. It could blow up tomorrow. And so a number of people would rather invest in guaranteed income, treasury bills, however, whether it's 2 or 3% of gold. And so for those small companies, startups who are focused on the small investor, related investors, their valuation needs to be as low and as super attractive as possible to allow the retail investor to overcome the fear of, should I invest in a guaranteed income, safe investment option, or should I take a bet on this startup that may or may not be available next year? But for the startups that, especially those in the growth phase, who are already earning revenue, who can demonstrate earning capacity, and who are willing, who have their books in place, and who are willing to attract institutional investors, I suspect there will be capital available for those. And we've seen it. I mean, we've had a few announcements in the last few weeks, right? Of companies that have raised $30 million. I mean, I think the last one was cash, what's it called now? That raised $13.5 million just last week. And so that, what that says is that things are possible. It's cheaper cash. Cheaper cash is the name of the company, and they raised $13.8 million just last week. And so it shows that things are possible, but you must be ready to operate at the level of the institutional investor. Okay.
Thank you very much for that. I see Haneef nodding, so I'm calling Haneef. So Haneef, on a financial advice, from a financial advisor standpoint now, what do you think? What do you think about the effect of a recession that is imminent on valuations and capital flows? Startups?
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think in terms of startups and accessing funding and financing going forward, given the climate that we are, there are certain things that are critical. Some of these things are critical not only in times like this, but generally there are things that startups have to have at the top of mind in terms of thinking about the business operations and thinking about opportunities for raising capital and for growing the business generally. I think the most fundamental point that I would like to touch on is the business model for the startups, each startup. And at times like this, it's very important that businesses go back to review their business model and revalidate it. So depending on the stage of the startup, if you are still at the very early stage, you're probably still tweaking and trying to design the best business model. But at times like this, even for established companies that are already generating revenue and making some traction in the market, you still need to go back and review the business model and then revalidate it. And what exactly do I mean by this? There are several elements from your business model that will determine whether you will be a successful business or not. And like Yinka mentioned when he was talking earlier, your business model needs to be profitable, needs to be scalable and sustainable. And what will determine that? There are several elements that you then need to be on top of to decide on, is your business model actually profitable? at the end of the day, are you generating more revenue than you're expending in terms of cost? So you need to look at that. And the first element that you want to consider is your customer segments and your targets. What are their needs? What are their pain points? COVID-19 has brought about different kinds of changes that we're seeing, and now the digital culture is changing very quickly. Even, public service where they rarely use anything digital. They are having Zoom meetings, and you can see the president having, sessions with his ministers and things like that. And schools that they never even was something important, they now need this service. And we're speaking with one of the clients that we advise is in the edutech section. And he said within the first 4 weeks of the COVID period, the number of orders they got for edutech was almost times 10 what they had gotten over the last 12 months. So that tells you that behaviors are changing and the needs and wants are also changing. So every founder, every business, every startup needs to review their business model and revalidate it and find out, are there new opportunities coming out of this change in behavior that we're seeing? Are there new risks that you're facing? When Mr. Niyi was speaking, there was something he said that really stood out to me, and that's the digital exclusion risk that we also need to think about. And then depending on who your target audience are, you need to look at some of these risk factors and ensure that whatever business model you are driving, it already incorporates that, and at the end of the day, you're going to come out with a positive cash flow. And I think that's very critical. Some of the other elements, which I'm not going to talk too much on, but are very critical as well, is your value proposition. At the end of the day, startups are they are created to solve problems and to solve, some of the biggest problems we have in society. And then when you start looking at some of those problems and how those problems are even evolving and changing, you also need to be looking at what is your value prop, and then what products, what services are you rendering? Is it meeting the actual need of your target? Because if you don't have a business model that is bankable, it doesn't matter if you're approaching individual or institutional, it's not just going to stick. So your business model is really what you need to pay attention to ensure that you're better able to access whatever capital you need. And I think talking from a financial considerations generally, aside from the business model, the bottom line should be, cash, cash, cash. And the importance of cash for startups and businesses cannot be overemphasized. Cash is literally the lifeblood of businesses. And if you run out of cash, then you're literally dead. So when you're designing your business model and looking at your customers, you also need to be thinking about, are you generating enough cash to sustain that business? And in terms of generating cash, the most important part that you need to look at is generating revenue that is recurring, sustainable revenue. And for some businesses or for startups, you're not yet at that stage yet where you're generating revenue. So you also need to look at what are the alternative ways of generating cash. It doesn't mean that because you're not generating revenue, you also neglect the importance of cash. So that then brings up the question of what other sources of cash can you leverage for a company that doesn't generate revenue yet? And over the last few weeks and months during this period, several institutions, global institutions and local as well, have come up with grants. And then they're offering grants to certain sectors, particularly sectors that are, maybe tech inclined or healthcare or some other essential services. So for pre-revenue startups, you can also consider looking at some of these grant options and trying to see which will best suit your needs. And then for other businesses that might also require funding to grow or to just pivot, then you're looking at what exactly or who exactly is your target investor. So for different kinds of different kinds of businesses and startups, there will be certain investors that are more relevant to you. So as a greenfield startup, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for you going to a financial investor like a private equity firm. Your deal is probably going to be too small and it doesn't probably fit their philosophy. So depending on the stage that you are as a business or as a startup, there are certain kinds of investors that will be interested. So you need to pay some attention to targeting your right investors, and then you create an ideal target for yourself. And then when it also comes to then reviewing and balancing your business model, we've seen that certain businesses have come up with new problems based on the changes in behaviors, and based on that, they've pivoted and created new services or added a new feature to their existing service. So that's something that you might also need to do given the current circumstances, and that adds a lot of muscle to your business model and pitch for investors for funding. And some examples that come to mind, in US, for example, companies like Tesla started producing ventilators when the demand was very huge. And locally here, I've seen companies either in the fashion space or even some tech companies that had to pivot and start designing, face masks and things like that. So depending on the time, you might need to consider those. But the important thing, and I know Mr. Niyi also made mention of this, is focus. Even if you are deciding to pivot during this period to make your business model more robust and agile, you need to be focusing on your areas of strength and areas that are complementary to your existing services. So you can't be doing something in maybe finance and all of a sudden you want to start offering online medical consultation or something of that nature. You need to focus on your areas of strength and areas that are complementary to you. And I think once you do that and you're also focused on generating cash, ultimate goal is to make sure that cash positive. I think the business model will be more robust and then it becomes more attractive to investors. And I think finally, and again, this point is also very critical, whether you're in capital raising mode or or just normal going concern mode, you need to stay on top of your business and your numbers. And what this means is you're not only delivering on your products and customer experience and whatnot, but you also need to stay on top of the numbers. What's your recurring revenue, what are the impacts that you're making, and those information that help you make better decisions, those metrics that investors are looking out for. So during this time, like we've also learned, several businesses are still raising money, and the idea is once the business model is right, once there's traction and they can see that you are growing in the right manner, investors will be ready to put in capital to support your business. So what that means is that if you're not tracking the right thing, then you're unable to make the right decisions and you're unable to also demonstrate the sort of traction and sort of performance growth that you need to do to warrant investors. So I think these are some of the key points that I think businesses need to be on.
Thank you very much.
Business model review at times like this is very critical to us, like your teammates, investors, and that's going to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Haneef. You have all said like amazing stuff, and we already have a lot of questions coming in. So we will take questions now. And the first question goes to, I guess, Mr. Olani. So he says, what would be your most important risk management advice? Your most important risk management advice for a startup or a business?
So risk management is a broad. Risk management is broad, and I think by nature startups are meant to be innovative. They are meant to take risk. So I would say surround yourself with a diverse team, right? So diversity of thoughts, so that not all of you are thinking in the same direction. So for instance, if I take my own firm, Verraki Partners, we have a few partners who are very risk conscious, and they're the ones that will ask questions. While some of us are eager and willing to move fast, you have those that will ask questions like, okay, have you considered this? What happens if this happens? So you need to have a diverse team and build a culture that allows people to be able to talk and surface their concern. And if you have a diverse team, hopefully you will have a very rich conversation within the team, and that will allow you to better identify risk and decide which risk you want to avoid, which risk you want to transfer to someone else, or which risk you want to better manage. But I think it starts from having the right team members and making sure they are. You allow diversity.
Okay. Do you guys have any additions? Haneef, Yinka, do you have any more additions?
No, I think the importance of people is very critical, and I think once you have the right people on board, you're better able to cut through the key risk, and then you're better able to address them. So I think people is very very critical.
I also think that for businesses who or businesses that exist in the world that we live in today and are still taking the back seat on integrating technology into their operations, I think in the world we live in, that's a recipe for disaster because there will be times, as we've seen in recent times, where people wouldn't be able to show up physically, but you need to set up relevant infrastructure such that you can still sell your product or provide your service remotely and with the same quality, with as near as possible in terms of in-person quality, right? So I think setting up relevant technology infrastructure will be critical for sustainability. So that's business recovery risk. I think is critical for founders to have that top of mind as well.
I think to add to that, one recent case in mind in Nigeria is the fact that also liaising with the right stakeholders and consulting. We've seen the importance of regulation in business. I think it was part of the debate recently and how, in Nigeria, businesses and even startups don't engage enough with regulators. And, the power the regulators hold to kill or make business very strong. So, with the right people in mind and also staffing the right functions, depending on the kind of startup you are, the industry you operate, and ensuring that those conversations and, engagements with the right stakeholders are happening very critical, because one morning the regulator can wake up and a policy just comes up and changes your entire business, and before you know it, you're dead. So I think that's very critical. It's a risk that can be very important.
Very important. Thank you very much, Haneef. The next question that we have is in agric. So it's in agric, and the person asks, in terms of food storage versus food security, and given that Nigeria is lagging behind in food storage, how can startups key into this area of food storage?
So maybe the first thing to ask ourselves is, so I mean, I'm not necessarily defining or describing a startup as just a pure tech play. A startup is any company less than 3, 4, 5 years, still is in infancy, yet to generate a lot of revenue, and ideally we hope that startup will be technology driven, technology enabled. So if you look at the food value chain, you have those who provide the inputs. The inputs, whether it is land, whether it's seeds, it's fertilizer, it's soil testing, and all the soil sciences that are required to determine the kind of plants that can grow well in an area and the kind of fertilizer mix or nutrient mix that needs to go to it. So a startup could just play in the organic fertilizer mode. And so instead of going to buy your NPK fertilizer, perhaps there could be organic fertilizers that we can do here and supply at scale. Or a startup could be in the soil science mode. One of the problems we have in Nigeria is we have 80 million hectares of arable land, of which about half of that has been farmed. But no one can tell me the best place in Lagos to plant rice, or to plant maize, or to plant palm tree. In India, for instance, that's one of the things India did several years ago. They did a soil scientific survey of the entire agricultural land. So they can tell you specifically using GPS, satellites, and all the rest, the best type of plants that can grow in a certain area, and the kind of fertilizers and others input you need to put. We don't have that yet. So for the most part, most of our farmers are farming blindly. We're farming based on faith. But if I put maize here and if I plant maize and I put fertilizer, it would grow. Of course it will grow. But the challenge is, what will be the yield? What will be the quantum of the yield? Right. And so that's an opportunity space in terms of just having the soil science information, which is almost like the way we have, you have DNA testing, or you have gene 54 gene in Africa. You could do that for the soil, and then you grow the soil, and then you need to store, and then you need to process. The question is, what are you storing? Are you storing the fresh foods, or are you storing the processed foods? Right? Because you could decide to store maize unprocessed, or yam, the yam tubers, or you could decide to process them into flour, and then you store the flour. So even the issue of storage needs to be better understood, that storage doesn't mean you're just storing the raw food, that the raw seeds or the raw food as it comes, fruits as it comes. You could decide to process it first. And I think for most of that really will be the ideal thing. So when mango is in season, you process mango into dry flour, which you can then store over time, as opposed to you wanting to store the mango fruit itself. For that question, I think you need a lot of domain experts. You need somebody who understands the industry, the sector, the agricultural practice, who can then help you determine where best to pitch. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. Just before we take your final words, I'm throwing this question at Yinka and Haneef. So someone asks, what are the funding opportunities available for startups in the agri sector?
I think like Mr. Yusuf said earlier, and you also alluded to yourself, that as certain industries are getting investors or investors are getting disinterested in certain industries, they're also increasingly interested in others. And agri is an industry that finance practitioners consider to be a defensive industry. So there are cyclical industries that are very exposed to economic cycles, such as if you're selling luxury goods, for instance, once the economy dips, your revenue dips as well. But with things like personal care, food, and similar things, they're defensive industries, so they don't vary as much with happenings in the larger economy. Now, what we'll find is that a lot of, especially institutional investors, they've been heavily, they had pre-COVID positions where they were invested. They had holdings in aviation, holdings in hospitality, and many of the traditional industries, right? And now the expectation is that some of these investors will be seeking to balance out their portfolios with new industries or new investments that have shown that they will be able to thrive. So for those of us that are sort of looking at businesses that have thrived through COVID and have projections still looking on the upside, then we can approach many of the institutional investors. And in addition to what we consider to be a strong investor messaging, the added spin for the institutional investors would be that this can help create the portfolio rebalancing that many of them are seeking in terms of trying to ride out the impact of COVID. The second thing is that for, like Haneef mentioned earlier, for startups now, if you're trying to raise pre-seed funding or seed stage or family and friends stage, now is not a good time, because in fact, all of us on this call are family and friends to some potential funders, and there's a lot of what we call hyperbolic discounting going on, which is you're valuing a business, but you're also adjusting that for your emotional fear of what's going on in the economy. So that hyperbolic discounting is causing inflated premiums, and it's causing people to significantly undervalue businesses. So businesses should look towards things like grants. I know funds by DFIs. I know the CBN has several initiatives going on. There's the one for businesses that have products or services that are supposedly supposed to help individuals ride out this COVID period. There's the healthcare fund. I mean, you see people like 54 and they're able to raise money, and similar startups. I know Kobo 360 is trying to raise some money as well, and then they're almost there in terms of closing the deal. So people are still industries that are able to create a strong enough investor messaging and that present a business model that has thrived through COVID and looks and appears as though it will continue to thrive post-COVID. I think those businesses still have a good chance of raising capital at good enough terms if they're able to communicate to investors opportunities that they present in terms of portfolio rebalancing outside of the regular business model argument. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very much. Haneef, quickly. Haneef, you are muted.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think regarding the funding opportunities for the agri space, I think Yinka has done a lot of justice to that question. But I think just to add that agri traditionally has been seen as a very high risk sector, and that's why the banks particularly are very sluggish in funding that sector. So in the past, what we've seen is that there have been several intervention funds where the CBN creates liquidity and through the bank disburse these funds to several agri businesses. You know, agri is one of the main sectors that, particularly in Nigeria, with the drive to diversify the economy, there are several intervention funds and there are a lot of support and incentive to promote businesses there. I think the most important thing for any startup that is looking to get into that space is critically understanding the risk that you are getting into. The space is very large, and like Mr. Niyi mentioned, you know, you might need an expert to clearly delineate the different value chains or the different segments within the value chain and understand where do you want to play, what are the risks in those areas, and how do you mitigate those. Once you're able to mitigate those risks and then also, you know, come up with your strategies to drive that interaction, there are several opportunities there that you can then tap into. And then I think in terms of from an investor perspective, not looking at debt, now looking at equity. Once you're able to demonstrate that you have, for example, strong off-takers, and we've seen startups that come in and say, okay, they have this arrangement with a major company like Nestle or flour mills, and then, you know, they're guaranteed to directly off-take. That will immediately de-risk that particular business, and depending on how many of those kind of corporates you can sign on, it's easier to then go and speak to investors, and then everybody can see the true value, and you'll be able to access capital. The next part is depending on whether you have access to good assets or like, you know, fiscal asset that you can use as collateral. With the current economy and then the, you know, the state of banks today, some of them might demand that they need like security, and even for startups, you'll be surprised they're going to ask you to go and bring land of X% to cover the amount of loan that you require. So that might also provide, you know, support for organizations or startups that are trying to access, you know, having some physical asset that you can use as security. But I think the most important thing is a thorough understanding of your risk and putting in place strong strategies to mitigate those risks. And once you're able to show that, you know, it's easier for you to attract funding either from, you know, some incentives like CBN windows or from investors or from even banks as well.
Thank you very much, Haneef. It's been an amazing session so far, very enlightening. I've learned so much. So just to round off quickly, Mr. Niyi Yusuf, would like to have your final word.
All right, thanks. I think we are going through unprecedented times. None of us on this call have witnessed a pandemic before, right? My prayer and hope is that we'll not witness another one in our lifetime. But we can only pray. Something tells me that we'll witness another one. And so we should prepare for any eventuality. And most entrepreneurs, most startups are always bullish. But I think it's also important sometimes you just step back and think through what can go wrong, so that you can then prepare for what can go wrong. So that way you build a more resilient business. We need the energy, the passion, the dynamism of the youth, the innovation that they can bring. But that also needs to be tempered with some realism in terms of building structures that can, our systems that can last through different crises. So whether that crisis is the crisis of the kidnapping of the CEO, or whether the crisis is the loss of a major contract, or is the fact that your staff work out tomorrow and they come up with a similar product like yours does down the road, or that crisis is the crisis of a pandemic. Businesses, startups, CEOs, entrepreneurs need to prepare themselves and their business to be able to respond quickly to changes, have the capacity to bounce back from such disruptions. You respond to changes, you bounce back from disruptions. You have the strength and the capabilities to keep going, even in the midst of adversity. And lastly, you have enough to be able to take advantages of any opportunity that may arise during that period. And all that speaks to building a resilient business, which is not a joke, and which is not a hobby. And so startup founders need to move from a hobby to this is business, and business requires serious attention and different set of rules. But I look forward to seeing a few startups who will trace their success to the last few weeks of this COVID pandemic. Thanks for Haneef for the opportunity. I'm talking.
Thank you very much, sir. But just before you leave,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Just before you leave, final words from you, Yinka, very quickly.
I think for me, I think Mr. Yusuf has said it all. There was a quote I came across recently where the speaker said, "Don't let a good problem go to waste." I think this pandemic, as much as it's a challenge, is as well an opportunity for many of us. Clearly, things will change, and we've always alluded to that. But personally, I'm very excited about the future because change is constant and is inevitable. And the best thing we can do is to prepare for change. And my message to the founders, entrepreneurs, and everybody else trying to move the needle on this call is that they should keep innovating. And I mean, I'm excited to see what the future holds. Thank you so much. I had a good time.
Yeah, Haneef, quickly.
Thanks a lot. You gave me the hardest job after they mentioned all the strong points. All right, but I think on a more serious note, I think my final words for founders particularly and businesses generally is you need to know your numbers. A lot of founders are design people or other people, and then they find numbers very boring. They are not interested in that stuff. They just want to build code, or they're interested in the technical area. But it's very important to know your numbers. You can't overestimate the importance of that because when you're speaking to investors, the only reason why they're investing in you is for the potential of future cash flows. So if you're unable to demonstrate thorough understanding of your business, of your industry, and of your performance, and how you gain traction, and what the potential looks like, then it will be more difficult for you to get them to. It's more difficult for you to get that capital that you so desire. So it's very critical you know your numbers, and once you do that, it also helps you make the best decision. Because now we're in an age of data, and everybody's trying to make the best decision based on what the data is telling us. So if you're not on top of these sort of things, then you might be making suboptimal decisions, and then it might not pan out very well. So I think know your numbers. Maybe other.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Mr. Niyi Yusuf, Managing Partner at Verraki Partners. Thank you, Mr. Yinka Ojikutu, Vice President, Leonine Investment Services. Thank you, Mr. Haneef Abbas, CEO, Leonine Investment Services. Thank you thank you to everyone that joined us today. It's been an enlightening session. Like I said, this session is recorded, and we are going to be providing you guys with a link to the recorded version subsequently, so that you guys can, if you want to reflect or you want to get back to it, you can always get back to it. And thank you guys for joining in, and have an amazing day.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.
Bye.